We're celebrating vision research. And also, we have upcoming very important game between France and Argentina. So, Serge, who is going to win?
Yeah.
Chris, why are you out of focus?
Fully.
Where's Tim?
So Serge is undecided yet who is going to champion. Well, it is the end of the year today. Unfortunately, it's our last seminar. And I would like to thank this young woman over there, Grażyna, for putting this program together for an entire year. And the good news is that she already make it move for the next year with many, many invitations.
Thank you. It will be a fantastic year. I hope you all looking forward to it.
So
And
next
she
year,
makes great bread. That was yummy. The Polish challah that you gave me was delicious. Thank you.
Fantastic.
next
I'm glad
year
you
we'll-
liked it.
So next year we will start with Janet Sparrow. I believe it's in January 6th.
7
Whenever, Friday.
Yes. At 8:30.
January 6th.
So today we're extremely lucky. We have Serge who joined us from California, so he's close by. Are you back in France?
No, I'm from France.
You're from France, right? France is a country in Europe, if somebody doesn't know. And John, do you know the capital of France? Hey, extra point for John. All right. With that, again, thank you very much for joining us this year, and hopefully I will see you all next year. We have lineup of fantastic speakers, but today is not exception, and we have Serge that we know about his research for decades, and so one of the leader of our field. With that, let me just move on to Damian. Well, I forgot to mention, we have a chief with us today, so please behave. Dr. Cooperman is with
No
us
chewing
today.
gum, huh?
So now these other things, okay?
It's all good.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for our seminar this morning. I'm Fang Yunfeng from Central for Translational Research.
We cannot hear.
And the microphone, I think, is off here.
How about now?
Why the
Oh,
focus is also off.
Yeah.
Weird, some weird technical issues today.
We cannot hear her.
Try again.
how about now?
It's okay.
Okay,
Good. Yeah, the microphone's on.
I'm
You're
sorry.
very fuzzy, though.
Yes.
Yes. I
Way out of focus.
don't know why.
You're all in good focus. The room is in good focus, but the podium mic camera is out of focus. We're not sure why. We'll figure it out.
My name is Fang Yungao from the Master Core of Central for Translational Vision Research. I'm also a member of Dr. Dorota Skronska Kraftcheck lab. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Serge Picaud. I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
He is silenced. Okay. Pico.
Okay. Trained at Marseille University, Max Planck Institute of Brain Research, and UC Berkeley. Dr. Picaud is the director of the Paris Vision Institute since January 1st, 2021. His team has developed ex vivo model from the pulsing retina, such as purified and cultured cone photoreceptors, or retinal explants that maintain the tissue architecture. His translational research has also involved animal experimentation on rodents and non-human primates. After investigating the mechanism of vision and understanding the retinal toxicity of anti-epileptic drug vigabatrin, his team focus has moved the last 10 years on the restoration of vision for blind patients. In a successful translation to the clinic, his team has validated a photovoltaic and wireless retinal prosthesis, both ex vivo and in vivo, on the primate's retina. paving the way for clinical trials in patients affected by age-related macular degeneration. As an alternative to retinal prosthesis, optogenetic therapy was evaluated on rodents and primates, opening the path toward clinical trials on blind patients affected by retinitis pigmentosa with the recovery of some vision performance. The team is now moving toward vision restoration at the level of the vision cortex for patients with optic neuropathies like glaucoma or diabetic retinopathy. The results of these projects have been translated in clinical applications with ongoing clinical trials. His work has generated over 150 peer-reviewed publications in the field of sensory neuroscience, with more than 20 patents leading to the creation of several spin-off companies. Dr. Picaud has also shown leadership as a founder and current executive director of the Paris Vision Institute, which is now integrated into the Institute Hospital University Foresight, together with the National Hospital Center for Ophthalmology, to accelerate the translation of therapies toward clinical trials and patients. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Serge Picaud, who will be presenting his talk entitled Vision Restoration from the Prosthesis to Sonogenetic Therapies.
Thanks a lot for the great introduction. So I'm very pleased and a little bit impressed because I see many huge names in the audience. So I'll try to do my best. So, you see my screen?
Yes, we can. I can.
Yes.
Okay. So I will try to introduce the work that we have been carrying at the Paris Vision Institute on visual restoration. So from prosthesis to sonogenetic therapy. So I'm not sure it was the right title, but this is the main idea. So I guess I don't need to introduce why it's not to introduce to the audience the fact that in the eye, in ophthalmology, we have different diseases affecting photoreceptors. And so these diseases are age-related macular degeneration or some retinal dystrophies, or we have other disease affecting retinal ganglion cells, the cells that send the information to the brain via the optic nerve. And these diseases with ganglion cell degeneration are mainly glaucoma and diabetic retinopathy. So the idea is that in these patients, we can try to prevent the evolution of the disease and try to avoid patients to become blind. And as you can see here in Paris, we have been developing different approaches from gene therapy, cell therapy, and also some pharmacological drug. But what I would like to introduce today is when patients are becoming blind, can we restore some vision with different approaches? And these different approaches were developed with two startup companies, Pixium Vision and GeneSight. These startups were created at the Paris Vision Institute. The idea is that when patients are losing photoreceptors, we still keep two neuronal layers. And what we would like to do is with different type of implants, for instance, like subretinal implant or epiretinal implant or optic nerve cuff, to try to reintroduce some visual information at the retinal level so that this information could be transferred to the brain and restore some vision. It's a different case when patients are losing retinal ganglion cells because they lose the link to the brain. And so if we want to restore vision, we need to restore vision at higher visual centers like the visual cortex. So I will first introduce what we have been doing in restoring vision at the retinal level. And finally, I will introduce what we are currently doing for patients losing retinal ganglion cells. The state of the art is the Argus 2 retinal prosthesis from the company's second site. So the patient have goggles where these goggles have a camera making images. These images are sent to microprocessors so that they can be converted into electrical matrix of electrical current. And so this matrix is sent to the receiver here. And you see the antenna here. And in fact, this box with the chip is attached around the eye. And then a wire is getting into the eye up to the electrode array attached on the surface of the retina. And so when you excite the chip inside, you can generate the currents that will activate the retinal ganglion cell. And with these, the patient were able to find a square on the screen when the system was on, but of course not when the system was off. And this was very stable in time. So this was quite nice because it means that there's no reaction in the eye to the implant. But the idea is that with 60 electrodes, this is the kind of images that a patient can see at most, because in fact, in many cases, all the electrodes were not active simply because they are not always touching the retina. And so, in fact, the resolution was less than what is shown in this type of images. And we already see that we need more than 600 units or pixels in order to recognize faces. So this is what we would like to aim in the project. So another important project was carried out in Tübingen by Professor Renner, and he could generate chips with more than 1,500 electrodes. And with these chips, some patients were able to read letters, but these chips were quite complex and they needed to amplify the current generated by the photodiode. And it's why the chip at the end of this wire was connected to a battery which was located behind the ear. And in fact, with these chips, it's not clear why, but approximately half of the patients could not really benefit from the chip. And although the surgery was very long, it's from 7 to 9 hours. So it was, it could not continue in clinical trial. I mean, although this was accepted by in Europe, finally it was retrieved from the market recently. And so we may wonder why these kind of devices are not efficient or sufficient to generate some images, although they have 1,500 electrodes. And one reason might be the following. In this type of implants, we have electrodes and the current has to return to a ground, and the ground is usually a distant ground. And so when the current diffusion was modeled, you see here at the electrode site the current level. And in fact, if you model, you see that in the neighboring area, the current level is fairly similar. And so one scientist, Blaziver, has proposed that if you create a ground grid around the electrode you can greatly increase the difference between the stimulated area and the neighboring area, especially if the ground grid is highly conductive. And so this was a very interesting type of organization. And it's why we have been working on different material like diamond or graphene to increase the conductivity of the ground grid. But I would like just to present you the work that we have been doing on a device that was first invented by Daniel Palanque at Stanford, and he's in the audience. So the idea of this very nice implant is that in fact you have an electrode, a central electrode, where a ground grid surrounding each of the unit. And in fact, the units are activated thanks to photodiode, infrared photodiode here. And so they not only provide the energy to the unit, but they also activate selectively some units. So it's why, in fact, the implant is completely wireless. And so you can see it here, one of these implants below the retina of a rat. And in fact, when Daniel and his team activated this implant by infrared, using such a multi-electrode array for ex vivo recording, you can see that after this activation with infrared, you have an artifact, but also you have spikes of retinal ganglion cell. So it's possible with this implant to activate a blind rat retina in the ex vivo condition. Then he moved to the in vivo condition, where the array here is in vivo, and it can stimulate the array with stripes, and so recording visual evoked potential at the cortical level. And with this kind of approach, he was able to show that the visual acuity of the rats with the implant was not too far from the visual acuity of a normal rat. So after this work, we discussed with Daniel Palanque and convinced him to have these implants produced in France by the startup Pixium Vision. And then we had to demonstrate that these implants could be transferred to clinical trial. So we decided to reproduce this type of data, but not on rodents, but on non-human primates. The difficulty was that we do not have blind human primates, so we tended to generate blindness in these, first in the ex vivo condition, recording on the multi-electrode array. And so for this, we took normal primate retina, and what we did was slicing the retina in the thickness so that we would remove the photoreceptors and keep the blind retina. So with this blind retina, we could record it on the multi-electrode array while we had the implant above in the position where it should be in vivo. And we could stimulate with infrared from below so that we would activate the implant and then record whether we got some spike into the retinal ganglion cell. And so the result was that yes, we could record spikes in the retinal ganglion cell. So we had again artifacts when we were stimulating. But in this case, what we did was to stimulate each single unit of the implant and then record the different ganglion cell. And we could show that some of the ganglion cells were responding to one unit, but not the other unit, meaning that we had a very good spatial resolution with the implant, as expected from the fact that they were containing ground grid. So with this result, we then moved to the in vivo condition. And so in vivo, you can see here the implant implanted in a non-human primate retina. So below the retina. And in fact, when we looked at the OCT, we could see that the layers from photoreceptors were disappearing. And in histology here, you see the green spots are the cone photoreceptors. And we can see that in only 5 weeks, they degenerate below the implant. And they do degenerate simply because we separate the retina from the choroid, and so the photoreceptor do not get all their metabolic support, and it's why they degenerate. And then, so this creates a blind spot, but just at the position of the implant. Then, to demonstrate efficacy with this implant, we designed a behavioral test where the animal is watching a central spot, and we were presenting a slightly in the periphery, a flash of light. And you can see that the animal was able to generate a visual saccade everywhere, except at the position of the implant, simply because the animal is blind at that position. But if we would then stimulate with an infrared light, you can see that the animal is seeing with infrared because he's generating visual saccade just at the position of the implant. And it was sufficient to stimulate one single unit in order to elicit this type of response. And of course, if we would stimulate with the same infrared intensity in other position, the animal would not generate a visual saccade. So this was demonstrating not only efficacy in non-human primate, in a blind non-human primate, because the animal was blind at the position of the implant, but also a high spatial resolution. So this allowed to go to clinical trial, and now there are patients seeing with these implants. You see, for instance, in the first clinical trial, the patient were able to read letters. They are now able to read words, and they were even able to go to the station and to read the computers to find out the platform where they were supposed to go. And also you see here the new goggle that they will be using, so that in fact this patient can use their natural vision, because this patient have age-related macular degeneration. So you see the implant is in the scotoma of this patient. And these goggles have a camera just in front of this dark rod. And at the back of this rod, you have a video projector in infrared, so that the infrared image would be projected in the pink ellipse on the retina. And with this implant, the visual acuity that is recovered in these patients are from 20/460 to 20/565. So it's very close to the level of legal blindness, 1/20. So a slight improvement would allow patient to recover really sight. And also what is very nice is that this patient can fuse the prosthetic vision with the natural peripheral vision. So we are very happy, and Professor Daniel Palanca has some new device with higher visual resolution, and we can expect some better even visual acuity. But at the time we had these results, we thought that maybe it would be nice to go to the cellular resolution. And cells in the retina are about 10 microns. So, and in these implants, the unit are 100 microns. So there's approximately a factor 10, which could be improved. And so I didn't tell, but there are 378 units in these implants. So the idea was that, can we go to the cellular resolution? And it's why we started to develop optogenetic therapy. So I guess you all know optogenetic therapy. The idea is that we have a unicellular algae that are sensitive to light, and this sensitivity is due to an ionic channel in the membrane. And this ionic channel is an opsin that is, in fact, an ionic channel. So in fact, it does hold the phototransduction cascade in a single protein. So the idea is quite simple. We take the genetic code of this ionic channel, we introduce it into an AV, inject the AV into the eye so that the AV can diffuse to the retina, and in the retina, it can transfect neurons so that these neurons will express the photosensitive opsin, the photosensitive ionic channel, so that these neurons will become photosensitive. And especially we did it in the retinal ganglion cells. Patient will then have to wear goggles because the sensitivity of these ionic channels are much less than our natural photoreceptors. But we can just normalize the light intensity in a high range. So in fact, this approach was proposed by Ernst Bomberg, who discovered these microbial opsins. And Zhao Pan in Detroit was the first to introduce channel rhodopsin 2 into the retinal ganglion cell of a RD1 mouse retina. And so in these blind mice, so you don't see the photoreceptors simply because these are blind RD1 mice. But if he would stimulate with light, he could record spikes into the retinal ganglion cells, meaning that he had reintroduced some light sensitivity into the blind mouse retina. So from this stage, we took over and we introduced not channel rhodopsin 2, but into the retinal ganglion cell of non-human primate. And you see that when we injected into the non-human primate eye the AAV to transduce the retinal ganglion cell, we had this macular ring because, of course, the ganglion cells are pushed away at the foveal site. So it's why we get this ring. And we isolated the retina and put it on a multi-electrode array again. And so when we did flashlight, we can see that we increase the spiking frequency of retinal ganglion cells. Each of these small bars represent a spike into the retinal ganglion cell. And we can see really that we increase greatly the spiking frequency of the retinal ganglion cell. I have to mention that all the ganglion cells have this kind of on response. And we can see that the activity that is measured at very high light level is only present where we have transfected the retinal ganglion cells. And this transfection affects approximately 1/3 of the retinal ganglion cell. The only trouble that we have was that this opsin catch was sensitive in the blue light range. And we know that blue light can be toxic to cells. And for instance, we have measured the toxicity of blue light on photoreceptors. And you can see that at 450, we are still toxic to cells. So it's why we decided to move to a red-shifted opsin that would be sensitive at 600 nanometers. And so we first tested which was the best AAV in order to express this opsin. And we found that AAV27M8, so with the mutation 7M8, was the most efficient. And also, we found that crimson air fused to TD tomato was more expressed than crimson air alone. So we decided to use this one. So in order to do the screening, we did it on a multi-electrode array, showing that we had many more ganglion cells expressing crimson air TD tomato in this condition. So you can see, for instance, this type of recording on the multi-electrode array. And so if I stop the record, oops, sorry. If I do stop the recording, you will see that we have a high correlation between the moving bar and the active electrode on the multi-electrode array. So this meant that with this optogenetic therapy, we had a high spatial resolution. And especially in this case, the moving bar is slowed down 4 times in order for you to see the activation of the electrodes. And then we also measured the response at different time duration. And you see here from 1 millisecond up to 50 milliseconds and even more up to 2 seconds. And what we observe is that, in fact, we reach a plateau around 50 milliseconds, meaning, in fact, that with 20, 30 milliseconds, we are already almost at the highest or saturating level. So this indicates that we could use video rate stimulation in order to activate the retina with this optogenetic strategy. So in order to go to clinical trials, we had to generate some goggles. And so the goggles are not containing a classic camera that is taking pictures, but the idea was to take an event camera. So this event camera is in fact sending events each time a pixel is passing a threshold of light. And you see when you increase light, you have pixels each time you cross a threshold, and you have positive and also negative events. So this is the kind of visual information that you get. The advantage is that you compress a lot the information. You only keep the edge of the image. You never saturate. You can even watch the sun and see the plane passing in front of the sun with this kind of device. And it could be very important for patients because they don't know where they watch. So we use this camera to generate the goggles, and this might explain also some response of the patient. And so what we did with this type of camera was that we could reconstruct at the millisecond precision the activity of the different retinal ganglion cells. And you see here, when we use this type of camera, we could reconstruct, in fact, all the information processing and all the spikes that are generated when you watch a face, and what are the information that each ganglion cell channel is sending to the brain. So with this, we could move to clinical trials, and this is the patient, the first patient.
We lost this. Was it?
This patient had retinitis pigmentosa for more than 14 years before he was injected with the EAV carrying crimson TD tomato. So this was the first patient able to use optogenetic to see, so to count object, to seize object. And now we have other patients who are able also to take pencils and to grab them. So we still need to demonstrate what are, or to measure the visual acuity in these patients. But what is, it's really the first time that a patient is seeing with optogenetic, and it's the first time that optogenetic is really introduced into a patient with efficacy. So now I would like to move on patients losing retinal ganglion cell and how we can activate their visual cortex. So in this condition. So the first would be this type of approach was Brindley and Lewin in the 60s. And you see here the transductors that were activating the electrode on the visual cortex. And so it's quite impressive. And in fact, when these electrodes were stimulated on the cortex, the patient was reporting seeing phosphine in the visual field. And there was a good correlation between the distribution of the electrode on the visual cortex and the distribution of the phosphine in the visual field. More recently, with the system proposed by Second Sight, some sequential stimulation of the visual cortex were allowing patients to see shapes and to see letters. But in fact, this sequential stimulation is fairly slow. So it means that this type of implant could not be used for dynamic vision. And also the currents that are needed are very high because of the stimulation on the visual cortex. It has been shown that if you can introduce the electrode in the depths of the visual cortex, you can reduce the current level in order to induce a saccade or to activate the neurons. So it's why different approaches were developed to stimulate in the visual cortex, and especially UTA rays were used to stimulate in the visual cortex. And this is a study that was published recently by the group of Peter Rosselma from Amsterdam, where it could not only map the position of all these UTA rays in the visual cortex, but after mapping these electrodes, it could create some letters by stimulating the different electrodes. And in fact, he had learned primates to recognize letters, so that first what he was doing was showing a letter on a screen, and then the animal would have to generate a visual saccade toward the letter he had just seen before. And in fact, then, so this was done by visual stimulation, and then it generated the letters by stimulating electrode in the visual cortex, and the animal could recognize the letter that was imprinted in the visual cortex. So this allowed clinical trials, and so you see that these electrodes were implanted in the visual cortex of patients. They could record the activity of cortical neurons, and you see that it was more or less stable over time, but also when stimulation were generated, patients could recognize some shape in their visual field. But when Peter Rosselma did the study in non-human primate, he could also report at SFN, last SFN this fall, that in fact the animals were losing sight due to this implant being encapsulated by some kind of fibrotic tissue. So this will not be possible to use for long-term in patients. So we decided to move to some kind of cortical stimulation, but with distant activation of the neuron. So at first we moved to optogenetic therapy because we thought that we could express crimson hair TD tomato in the visual cortex. We were also able to record the activity when we were stimulating with light, and you can see that the intensity of the response was highly dependent on the irradiance. So we could record it not only with penetrating electrodes, but also by recording with functional ultrasound imaging. And we had a good correlation with the two measures. But when we were thinking of moving this type of strategy into clinical trial and starting to record from non-human primate visual cortex, we realized it was very difficult because we had to use some device to activate with light into the visual cortex. And it's very difficult. So we can either use some kind of windows on the visual cortex, but you have to remove the dura, or you can penetrate the visual cortex with optic guide, but then this is also quite invasive. But at this time, we were also recording with functional ultrasound imaging the activity in the visual cortex. And you can see here the nice anatomical image that we get with functional ultrasound imaging as compared to MRI images. And so with this, we could measure also the increase in the blood flow that we have, for instance, in this area, when we present a visual stimulus in the visual field of the animal. And you see that in only 10 trials, either with 500 milliseconds or 2 seconds, we have very similar kind of response. And with this, we were able to measure the retinotopic map in the visual cortex. And also here you can see the ocular dominance column that we were able to measure, not only in the superficial layers, but also quite deep into the visual cortex. So if we are able to image like this, we could maybe also stimulate with ultrasound. And so we decided with Michael Tonter to try to see whether we could design a way to stimulate the visual cortex, not by light, but by ultrasound waves. So the whole idea is quite similar to optogenetic therapy. So what we want to do is to take a mechanosensitive protein, take the genetic code of this ionic channel, put it into an AAV, inject the AAV into the visual cortex so that neurons would express this mechanosensitive channel and would become sensitive to ultrasound. So for patients, they would wear goggles to make some kind of images, and these images would then be projected by ultrasound on the visual cortex. And this would allow us to keep the dura intact so that we will not have to remove the dura on the brain. So is it completely science fiction, or could we provide a proof of concept? So we have injected the visual cortex of rodents, and we could get expression of a mechanosensitive ionic channel. So this channel is called MSCL. And so we could show that we have a high number of neurons that were expressing this ionic channel. And then we could record the activity while we are imposing some ultrasound stimulation on the visual cortex. You see here, when we did record with a penetrating electrode, we can measure the increase in spiking activity in cortical neuron. And you see that we have high latency because this is the time for the information from the eye to the visual cortex. But if we do ultrasound stimulation of the visual cortex, you can see that the response is very fast, the latency is very short, and this is present only if we have injected the AAV to express the mechanosensitive ionic channel. If we do not express this mechanosensitive ionic channel, ultrasound do not have any effect on the visual cortex. So I want to attract your attention on the nice spatial temporal resolution of this sonogenetic stimulation, because you see that the response is as fast and even faster than the visual response. And also the decay time is quite fast. So with this, we could even stimulate at a frequency of 13 Hertz frequency, so suggesting that we could have quite high dynamic response in the visual cortex. The second question was, can we get some spatial resolution with this approach? So you see here, when we used ECOG array at the surface of the visual cortex, we could record the visual evoked potential, but we could record also the response when we were stimulating with ultrasound the visual cortex. So you see here the response that were, again, with a very short latency, of course, and that were depending on the time of the ultrasound stimulation, the duration of the stimulation, and also we could measure the area that was activated by the stimulation. And what was quite nice was that when we moved the transducer over the visual cortex to this area, you see that we could show that we were able to, in fact, displace the stimulation area, the stimulated area. So with this approach, we not only have temporal, but we have also a high spatial resolution that would be compatible for visual restoration at the cortical level. So the final question that we asked was the animal able to perceive phosphine when we did ultrasound stimulation of the visual cortex? So to test this idea, we designed a behavioral test where the animal was receiving water when we did a flash stimulation. And you see that the animal learned that each time we do a flash of light, it will receive water. It will receive water. And of course, we have deprived the animal from water at the beginning. And you see here that at the end of the training period, the animal was generating response over 60% of the time. And after these 4 days of training, we changed and we did an ultrasound stimulation over the visual cortex. And then you see that the animal is performing as well with the ultrasound stimulation of the visual cortex as the visual stimulation. So this response to the ultrasound was present only if we had transfected the visual cortex with the mechanosensitive protein. If we did not, you see that the animal was not responding to the ultrasound stimulation. So the response is really specific to the expression of the mechanosensitive ionic channel. So just to finish, I just want to show that when we increase the acoustic energy, we see that the behavioral response was higher. And this is correlated with the measurement of the activated area, which is highly dependent on the acoustic energy that we apply on the visual cortex. And this reminds the result when having electrode on the visual cortex. The higher the current, the higher the intensity of the phosphine perceived by the patients. And the final result was measuring the latency of the response to the visual and ultrasound stimulation. You see that the latency for the visual response was higher than the response to the ultrasound stimulation of the visual cortex. And this is highly correlated to the long latency for the visual response at the cortical level and the very small response latency, very small latency when we stimulate with ultrasound at the cortical level if the AAV has been injected before. So this clearly demonstrates that this ultrasound response is really due to the activation of the mechanosensitive ionic protein. So this proof of concept has enabled us now to move to non-human primates. So we have already expressed the mechanosensitive ionic channel into the visual cortex of non-human primate. And we will try to demonstrate that it's possible to generate some kind of form vision in non-human primates when the animal is stimulated at the cortical level. So with this, I need to, and just to conclude, that we have been able to generate visual restoration in blind patients with retinitis pigmentosa or age-related macular degeneration. So in the case of age-related macular degeneration, it was with the Prima implant, which generated the best visual acuity with visual prosthesis. And we are close to the threshold of legal blindness. The alternative solution is optogenetic therapy. In theory, we could have much better visual acuity, but this has to be demonstrated. And so the clinical trials are still ongoing. And the future project is visual restoration at the cortical level, but by sonogenetic therapy. With this, I would like to thank all the team who helped me to do this, especially Sarah Cadoni, who did all the study on Sonogenetic, Kevin Blaise, who did the imaging with functional ultrasound imaging. Paul-Henri Prévost did the retinal prosthesis, and I'm not sure that you see Gregory, who did the optogenetic study. And of course, this was thanks to a great also support by the team at the Vision Institute, like Denis Delcara, who did all the work with the AVs. Jens did many recording also with patch clamp recording. Riyad generated the goggles. And of course, Jose, who ignited all the projects on visual restoration at the Paris Vision Institute. The company GeneSight for optogenetic therapy, Pixium for retinal implant, and the partners like Daniel Palenka at Stanford University, Botan Roska for optogenetic therapy at the FMI in Basel, and also Michael Tanter at Physics for Medicine in Paris, and Pierre Puget, who helped us a lot on non-human primates in the non-human primate facility. And of course, we have the support of many institutions helping us to generate all these data.
Okay, thank you, sir. Good news, we have Daniel Palanker with us today, and he's going to make a final comments. So Daniel, thank you for doing that. And let's start with the first question by Gordon.
Oh, I put the question in the chat, but I'll ask it.
But we wanted to hear you. We wanted to see you.
That's sweet of you, Christophe. Serge, I was wondering why you use MSCL. That's such a large conductance channel, and I would worry about damage to the cells.
Well, we screened different ionic channels, and this was the only one which really generated a response due to ultrasound stimulation. So the way we did was to express first in the retina, because it's very easy to inject the AV into the eye, then isolate the retina, put it on a multi-electrode array, and test whether we have ultrasound response. And doing this, we did screen many different ionic channels, supposed mechanosensitive ionic channel, and MSCL was the only one generating a response. And in fact, in the MSCL, you can have different type of ionic conductance. So it's not clear whether you go to the higher conductance when you generate this type of ultrasound stimulation. So when we did some kind of safety study, we couldn't see really damage. And the fact that we were able to stimulate the visual cortex for 4 consecutive days in the animal, in the living animal, suggests that we did not induce a massive degeneration in the visual cortex. So we still have to demonstrate that this strategy is safe, but the first evidence were quite positive.
Okay, thanks. Good luck
Maciej.
someday.
Okay, it's me. Hello. Hello, Serge.
Hello.
Great to see you. So thank you very much for a fantastic talk. And it's really inspirational a lot. And I love this idea of sonogenetic therapy. But if you calculate, what is the possibility to get the maximum resolution for the ultrasound waves, it comes that with a 50 megahertz stimulation, you can get like 400 by 400 points maybe resolved in one plane. Is there any option to encode this information also in depth in the visual cortex? Is there any mechanism to differentiate this information? So maybe this is too early question, but this is really fantastic.
No. I think this is the major question. So when they used Utah arrays, each individual electrode is separated. The spacing between the electrodes is 400 microns. So what we got with this, the transducer that we were using at 15 megahertz, we were already at this 400 micrometer. But it's possible to use, when you use 15 megahertz, you can even go to 100 to 200 micrometer. So this means that we could have much better resolution than the Utah arrays. And if we could do this type of resolution, we could have matrix that would be up to 10,000 points. And we can also go in the depths of the visual cortex. The thing is that the stimulation is quite elongated. So the resolution in XY is better than in Z. So it's clear that the Z resolution will be less than the XY. But so this suggests that the part that is really in the depths, like in fact, the lateral part of the image, we will have lower resolution than the one that we could have in the vertical axis of the image.
And maybe follow-up questions about the sensitivity. These ionic channels, are there always like very sensitive to vibrations, or there are some conditions that can I don't know, influence this sensitivity and have like the spectrum of responses from these channels? Is this very uniform, or what is? I have completely no feeling.
Well, you can stimulate from 0.5 megahertz to 15 megahertz. The idea is that we would like to use 15 megahertz because the resolution, the spatial resolution, is much better, and also because these waves are really not propagating too deep into the tissue. So we could be, I mean, in terms of safety, it would be much better.
Okay.
And we would have no kind of reverberation of the ultrasound waves if we do like this. But this means that we would have to remove the skull. So we would either have to remove the skull to put an artificial skull, or to put the stimulating array at the position of the skull.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much, Serge. Thank you.
Serge, I have a very simple question, and it couldn't be any simpler. So you have shown us several techniques, with the ultrasound or genetics or mechanical or electronic devices. So my question to you, if you will have that patient today, which of the techniques today you think is the most promising that will restore maximum amount of vision? And the follow-up question is, what will happen 10 years from now? What is your projection? Which of those technologies will be? Of course, you can be wrong. Nobody can prove you right today or wrong. So please, if you could speculate on those two questions.
Well, I think the optical stimulation will generate a higher resolution. So thanks to the optical window of the eye, it's easier to stimulate the retina if you have a nice stimulation. So optogenetic in the eye or the photovoltaic device should provide a better resolution than any kind of ultrasound stimulation. So, and if I would be a patient, I would not like to have a surgery unless to the brain, unless it's really necessary. So I think if I would be proposed either a surgery on the eye or a surgery on the brain, I think I would prefer a surgery on the eye. I think all the patients with photoreceptor degeneration, I guess the solution will be either photovoltaic implants or optogenetic therapy in the eye. But for patients losing the ganglion cell and with optic nerve degeneration, the only solution is to activate in the brain a higher visual area. So, and the visual cortex is on the surface, it's providing a very large area for stimulation. So I would assume that then this is the only solution, or the best solution. But
so with those patients that you have tested with different approaches, did you do MRI of visual cortex? Do you have enough signal to record the visual cortex activity?
so we didn't do any patient, any activation of the visual cortex in patient ourselves. Sonogenetic at the moment is only in preclinical study. So we first need to demonstrate that we can produce form vision in an animal before
The
we.
devices, you already have it, right?
No, we only generate some kind of, maybe some kind of phosphine, but we didn't demonstrate form vision. So we really need to demonstrate form vision before we can really move to clinical trial.
Okay, John.
Hello. Thank you for an amazing presentation. I was just curious to know, you nicely showed this optogenetic therapy of around phobia, where you showed this ring of ganglion cells that were optogenetically modified. I was curious to know, how do you go from this ring of modified cells to potentially an image with the light stimulus?
It's a good question, especially also we only get on response despite the fact that we have many different types of ganglion cells. So it's clear that the signal is not the best, and also the retinotopy is kind of deconstructed. So the idea is that in the future, now that we have demonstrated that it's possible to express the microbial opsin in patient, it's possible to activate, and patient can use the visual information. We need to kind of generate some new goggles where we could monitor the position of the eye and stimulate with a better kind of stimulation so that we could deconvolute the image and stimulate properly the ganglion cell where they are. So this would be one thing, and maybe the other thing would be to have a more specific promoter so that we could, for instance, have only the on-midget, for example, so that we could generate a stimulation that would be specific for on-midget cell so that the brain would better understand the signal that is arriving.
Thank you.
Andrew.
Thank you for a great lecture. I'll modify my question a little bit because it's very similar to what Dr. Fain and Dr. Palczewski asked, but in terms of all these different strategies and the long-term durability of therapy and the safety of each of these strategies to neurons, stimulating with light, stimulating with electrodes, or stimulating with sound, can you posit a possible model for conducting a long-term analysis before even going into a living animal necessarily for evaluating safety? Would it be brain tissue? Would you do retina tissue? Would you do it in an animal or out of an animal?
No, I think we could do in animal because we could stimulate for several hours. That is what, as it was done, for instance, for retinal implant. The retinal implant were introduced into an animal and stimulated for hours before it would go to patients. So we could similarly do some ultrasound stimulation in an animal and then checked either immediately or later whether the cells were degenerating and they were kind of removed from the animal. So this is possible to do.
But even in, I mean, these therapies are supposed to be durable for maybe years at a time. So, long-term stimulation is probably the more important question as opposed to the short term.
Yeah, but you can only at least test whether the cell can be stimulated for quite long hours. But then, I mean, if you do not induce degeneration for these long hours stimulation, I mean, it's unlikely that it will change if you stimulate for years.
Thank you.
I would not be concerned.
Zach?
Thank you, Dr. Picaud, for that really interesting talk. So I was wondering if there's any way you can get like tunability with some of the implant modalities, basically where you can get kind of initial responses from the electrodes, like recordings of the electrode responses, and perhaps make some surgical corrections or use other techniques to kind of improve gaps in responses, perhaps.
Do I understand well that you ask me whether we can do some kind of feedback?
Yeah, like a feedback-based adjustment of some of those implants to make them more efficient.
But the idea is quite difficult to do. I mean, like with the photovoltaic implant, because they are not recording. So in this case, it's not possible. In the case of optogenetic, it's quite difficult to tell what is the activity of the neurons because you have no way of assessing the activity. With ultrasound, with Sonogenetic, but maybe one day we will be able to do simultaneously stimulation and recording so that we could have a kind of a feedback loop for the stimulation.
So would that entail like more treatments with AEV then, or?
Well, if we want to have the sonogenetic activation, yes, we need to have an AEV treatment in order, or some kind of genetic treatment in order to introduce the mechanosensitive ion channel into the cell.
Thank you.
All right, let's move to Rafael and Cesare.
Hello, Dr. Picaud. Really exciting talk. I have a quick question related to Dr. Brown's question. What would be the lifetime of the subretinal implant? Would it be like 5 years, 10 years, for life? Would it correlate with, would it be enough for life of the patient? Or what's your estimation for this?
Well, I mean, maybe Daniel can answer better than I, but all the studies that were done on long life testing of these implants suggest that they are very stable and that they could be used for years. So it looks like they could really be stable for the life of the patient, but maybe Daniel, you have better answer than I could do.
Yeah, no, it's exactly correct that the lifetime of the implants with silicon carbide coating will probably exceed lifetime of the patients. And so I think that future archaeologists will be wondering what is this piece in the eye.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Okay, Cesare.
Hello, Dr. Picaud. Thank you for your talk. It was really amazing. I have a question regarding 3D vision. And would it be possible? I mean, what would be the approach to generate the depth vision? Would you need like 2 cameras to project to allow for 3D vision with Sonogenetic approach?
Yeah, maybe you would better need the 2 eyes. So, and but currently, when transfection or prosthesis are applied in patient, they are only applied on 1 eye. So up to now, I'm not sure that they have proper vision, except by moving the eyes or moving the head, so that they can have some kind of depth perception.
All right, and now, highly anticipated final comments from our friend Daniel.
Well, so Chris just asked me to make this final comments in the middle of the talk, so it's not prepared. And so I will just share a few thoughts. First of all, thank you very much, Serge, for providing the summary. We actually met with Serge a few weeks ago, and so it's nice to see you again. So first of all, an update on clinical status of the photovoltaic implant. Yesterday, we completed the implantation of the pivotal clinical trial, 38 patients in Europe and US in total, and that will be analyzed in 12 months of follow-up, but that's a big milestone that 38 patients are now full enrollment basically in this trial, and the results so far unofficially look as good as the first, at least maybe even better than the first 5 patients in a feasibility trial. So the another update is that we just published a week ago a paper about new pixel design with 20 micrometer pixels. So it's 5 times better than the clinical design now, and have shown that acuity in rats exceed that this pixel size is better than natural acuity in rats. So the natural acuity is 30 micron, 28 micron, and pixels are 20. So now the limiting factor in animals, at least in rats, is natural wiring in the retina in the brain, not pixel size. But with these pixels in humans, we hope that it will be transitioned by Pixium vision into clinical trial and hope to achieve 20/80 acuity. If that will work in AMD patients, it will be a useful device. 2400, which we see currently matching the pixel size, is still, I think, a nice proof of concept, but not really a big market. And so that's really a big concern, that you have to reach a performance that enables reasonable acceptance on the market for any technology. And currently with Prima, I think 100 micron pixels is just a nice proof of concept that you can create form vision. And that brings me to the next, maybe most important point, that resolution of the implant or resolution of the stimulus, optogenetic or sonogenetic, is necessary condition, but not sufficient for visual perception of that level. The proof of that, we have seen many actually proofs. For example, with Argus 2, what patients saw basically was flickering light. It's not form vision. Also, we see with optogenetic studies in humans that Serge was showing the video during the talk, it's basically light perception. It's not really form vision, at least what we see from the kind of the videos published. Similar experience was with cortical stimulation, when the pattern, at least with ECOG electrodes placed on the surface, that when you apply a pattern stimulus, not always patients see a pattern percept. Very often they saw single percept, and that's why Dr. Yoshor had to come up with this innovative kind of approach that they scan basically from one electrode to another to produce a letter, because if you stimulate this letter simultaneously, the pattern, patients didn't see a letter, they saw just one phosphine. And that is a common theme for many applications, as I mentioned. So we should be careful. We are working with a very complex neural system that does a lot of image processing to whatever we input into it, and the output is not always obvious. What will come out as a percept is not always exactly like the resolution of the pattern we put in. Fortunately, with subretinal implant Prima, The perception is form vision, and I think it's the first time that patients really see a letter simultaneously and right away without like retraining and so on. Although they need to know how to, where to look because of the glasses and so on. But still, it's an important comment, I think, that when we show resolution in stimulus, it's very nice, it's necessary, obviously, but it's not obvious until you do clinical trial what really is a perceptual kind of resolution. And so I'm looking forward to Sonogenetic results in clinic whenever they come, and I hope that they will generate pattern vision, and that will be a very exciting, certainly, step. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I also want to thank Serge and José Sahel, who really enabled this clinical translation of our technologies. They created a company and offered our technology being transferred to this, and I am very grateful to Serge and José for doing that, because without this we would be just playing with animals and didn't know if it really works clinically. So thank you very much for doing this very important translational step. And I wish you best of success with other technologies being translated into clinic, where we can see how really well they perform.
Very well. With that, I wish you a wonderful holiday season and see you in January.